Okay, so writing about movies, even with my completely unprofessional setup, is hard. Well, not hard as in it's a difficult thing to get done, but hard as in hard on my own brain once it's all said and done. Assuming this video gets done when I plan it to, it will have been at most a few days since I've posted a review of Deadpool. It was 100% my opinion, I gave it a 7.5 out of 10, and FYI, both that video and this one will be completely spoiler-free, for all those worried about that sort of thing. Yet, even though predictably hardly anyone has watched it, and literally no one has commented on it or complained about it on or off YouTube, I still can't help but get this nagging feeling that I wasn't entirely fair to the movie. But why? Why do I have that feeling, and what does fair even mean in this context? Yeah, you could argue I've just been looking at all the 9s and 10s that people both more and less professional than myself have been showering on it, and I'm feeling that utterly human need to conform, but I don't think that's what it is. Thinking about it, I think the problem is I'm just kind of a hypocrite. See, the problem isn't that I gave Deadpool anything less than a 10 or a 9 or even an 8 out of 10, but rather my own reasoning. Anyone who knows me personally knows that I believe all film criticism is 100% subjective. Everything from quality of writing to quality of set design is dependent entirely on individual taste. And while we may blend the admittedly numerous intersections into some kind of basic list of requirements into what makes a film good or bad, even those are about as bunk as you can get if you're trying to be objective. Massive air quotes around that word. With that said, your standards are your standards, and if you want to be taken seriously, you should probably try to maintain consistency with what makes something good to you. A truly great review of The Dark Knight Rises by Captain Logan over at Geek Evolution that just came out has really got me thinking about what it means to maintain convictions in regards to how we critique movies, or any form of art for that matter. So long as there's some semblance of logic to it, any complaint that you could throw at any movie is valid along with any defense to said complaints. With that said, most sets of individual standards, mine included, have to take into account genre, as different genres means the film is going to try and elicit different emotions within the audience. And this is where Deadpool comes back in. I mentioned in my review that considering comic book movies a genre unto themselves bothers me in the same way it would if we made adaptations of novels its own genre. Like novels, like animation, and like film itself, comic books are an art form unto themselves with many different and varied genres contained therein. And yes, even in today's modern comic book movie onslaught, where most of them share a very similar structure and dip heavily into the sci-fi genre, I doubt they would be considered the same genre by anyone if they hadn't shared a source material. That being the case, let's look at what more legitimate genre labels Deadpool falls under and use that as a broad example of the subjectivity I'm talking about. Deadpool as an action movie. I noted in my review that I felt we could have possibly used a bit more action, but looking back I don't know that there's really anything I'd have added. Some people might not have liked the action that was there, that's perfectly possible. I did. I've enjoyed other action scenes far more, but given how much of the action is tied into the jokes, they kind of work hand in hand. Speaking of which, Deadpool as a comedy. Now I know for a fact that some people didn't like this. I did. I made a point in the review that not every joke landed, and I'm sure if I were to watch it again, there would be a lot of jokes I just wouldn't laugh at without the benefit of an audience laughing around me. Of course, some people just don't gel with every kind of humor there is, and Deadpool is known to revel in being juvenile without a hint of irony. However, on the whole, I do think it was far more funny than it was unfunny. Deadpool as a love story. There were also people who didn't like this aspect of the movie. I did. The movie is centered around the relationship between two characters, and that's really the driving force of the plot. As far as relationships in action movies go, I found these two incredibly endearing, and I find myself wishing they'd shared even more screen time together because they're just so cute! I said the whole movie could have just been these two, and I meant it. If we get Deadpool 2 and Morena Baccarin's role is in any way diminished, I think we'll be losing something great. So yeah, that's the movie. Operating under the very broad criteria it sets for itself, I have a net positive feeling about it. Not a spectacular feeling, but again, this isn't about the fact I gave Deadpool a 7.5, it's why I did. The fact that not 100% of the jokes landed and the action wasn't outstanding wasn't at the forefront of my mind when I was thinking of criticisms. No, instead, my biggest gripe with the movie is that it wasn't what it could have been. Which is basically a vaguely pretentious way of saying it's not exactly down to the letter what I was looking for going into it. And you know what, you could argue that's a perfectly legitimate complaint, but let me counter. Forget for a second the media landscape we live in, driven entirely by marketing and adaptation and hype culture that dictates that you know how you feel about a big budget movie before you even sat down and watched it. Forget the idea that you may have seeded into your head already, even as someone who hasn't seen it, that Avatar is overrated because it seems to have hardly made any impact despite the money it gathered. If you're someone who hasn't seen Kung Fu Panda, try to forget that DreamWorks Animation had made a small stream of poorly received features just before that point. And if you're the version of me from a couple of days ago, forget that there's a metric ton of movies in the same quote-unquote genre as Deadpool that could be used for a buttload of material that then forces said surrounding genre into a state of change. Because that's just not part of the story that Deadpool wants to tell you. Yes, you could say it opened the door to this concept only to not step all the way through, but the point still stands that it's only in my own mind that it ever had the obligation to step. Hell, forget that there was even a comic in the first place and just look at it as a movie. Now, it's true that nothing exists in a vacuum, and we all take into account what stories we've already experienced whenever we watch or read anything. It's why the word cliché even exists. But if all our judgments are going to be comparative, then we should drop all pretense of legitimate criticism and just admit that we all want our expectations both met and defied at arbitrary intervals. We get mad at movies or even entire franchises for maintaining a formula, but then get mad when that formula is broken. We imagine entire plots in our heads based solely on trailers that only exist to make sure we have a seat in the theater. We all literally judge books by their covers, and if you say you haven't, then you're lying. We confidently condemn stories we couldn't even be bothered to finish because it wasn't going where we wanted. Projecting our expectations as a measure of quality is something that we do all the time, especially for comic book movies where the running joke for years has been a complete refusal on the part of the comic fan to accept any change from the source material, even if it might lead to a more interesting story in an otherwise mostly faithful project. There are base desires and tastes that we all like to have met, and that's a large part of why we go to fiction in the first place. But I like to think that I personally am at least above saying that a work should be thought less of because it didn't spoon-feed me exactly what I would have done with it. If I can find a problem in the execution of existing elements, then I'll complain about it, and if I, like many others, think I could tell a story better than what I'm given based on execution alone, I'll feel free to point it out. But the absence of something that was never an obligation shouldn't be the one thing I spent half a video complaining about. I'm human, so I'm going to slip up on this issue a lot, so I remind both you and myself to rewatch this video whenever I do, assuming anything I just said was worth saying at all. I went into Deadpool hoping for a movie that would kick into gear a new status quo. That was never the movie it wanted to be, and that's not fair.